Can everyone hear me? Just give a thumbs up. Paris, can you hear me? Thank you. Okay. Well, may as well get stuck into it. So hello, everyone. Tonight, I'll be discussing some work related to my thesis concerning the penultimate volume of Alain Badiou's Being and Event trilogy entitled The Immanence of Truths, which for the remainder of the talk, I'll just call Immanence. So there's been some recent articles that have discussed this work in detail, but they generally only deal with aspects of the work. By contrast, my goal in this talk will be to provide a sketch of the global philosophical structure of the text and how I at least think it should be read. So keep in mind, this is a work in progress. I will not provide a full account of Badiou's conceptual armature or a complete description of immanence. Though tonight's sketch is experimental, it contributes towards a general historical redescription of Badiou's oeuvre. In the context of my PhD, I'm developing this analysis in order to engage in the ethics of thinking, where I evaluate the ethical consequences of Badiou's formation of the self. The intellectual historical methodology therefore constructs a meta-philosophical space that opens engagement with the meta-ethical question, how do our practices that produce a certain kind of self inform our ethical behavior? But I'll leave aside this broader background for tonight to simply engage with immanence. So my talk will primarily have 4 parts. First, I'll briefly explain the intellectual historical methodology I'll be using. Second, I'll discuss Ian Hunter's account of being an event and briefly problematize his reading of Badiou as being a Heideggerian. So third, I'll extend this approach to immanence in order to demonstrate that my claim that Badiou's philosophy is distinct from Heideggerianism. And fourth, which is the main part of the talk, I'll discuss Quentin Meillassoux' reading of immanence and argue that the teachings of this work, The Immanence of Truths, constitute a politically infused variation of Neoplatonic spirituality. So first, what is a spiritual exercise? People don't like the word spirituality. Okay, so, well, too bad, like it's a great word. So before I jump into immanence, I want to give you an idea of this methodology that I'll be using. So Pierre Hadot was a historian of ancient philosophy, and he wanted to basically answer the question, how do we explain the apparent incoherence of philosophies and their philosophers? We can't simply put them together as some interconnected logical or axiomatic system. I mean, like as if they are some like an axiomatic system like in modern mathematics, right? Because they're inconsistent between and within their own texts. We can try and do it. Analytic philosophers do it all the time. And this is fine if we are clear that we simply want to relate some old philosopher to our contemporary problems. Think of the panoply of analytic misinterpretations of Kant, for instance. But it must be said that in this process, the actual philosophy of the author is hardly elucidated. What's worse, if we're not careful, we may end up substituting a pseudo-history for the real one, as many neo-Kantians or neo-Hegelians do today. Hadot's answer, by contrast, is that if we take a contextually sensitive historical perspective, then the primary aim of ancient philosophy, or philosophies, was not to elaborate a theory, nor some coherent exegetical strategy, or even primarily an ethical doctrine. Ancient texts were not composed in order to exposit a system, but to produce a formative or educational effect. Hadot understands philosophical texts and the discourses they transport as a way to transform the self of the participant. Such practices are thus not restricted to mere intellectual exercises such as knowledge acquisition, exegesis, or logical clarification. Rather, they serve to transform every aspect of the participant, including their imagination, will, and sensibility. Now, this idea might seem obvious. Don't we all know philosophy is about how to live the good life, or that's supposed to be the purpose? But Hadot was the first person to really take this idea seriously from a historical perspective, at least that I'm aware of, and reflect it within his analytical approach, and consistently. So indeed, Hadot defines the schools of ancient Greece by the existential attitudes that precede and condition their philosophical discourses. We therefore have a distinction between a philosophical discourse and the philosophy itself, or it as a concrete practice. So for Hadot, both inform one another, but one misses the core of a philosophy when one tries to understand it at the purely discursive level. To use the language of J.L. Austin from ordinary language philosophy, there is the locutionary act, or the propositional content of the text, which makes claims about states of affairs and thus has a reference. And then there is the text as a speech act, that is, as a contextually situated illocutionary act. For instance, if I say, I will see you tomorrow, there is the propositional content of the sentence, which would be equivalent to the state of affairs where I do in fact see you the next day. And then there is the sentence considered as an act, which in this context would be a promise to the listener. I'm making a promise to the person. So in saying philosophy is a spiritual exercise, we are saying that it is defined insofar as it is aimed at a determinate purpose in a specified temporal and spatial context. By studying philosophy as a speech act, or more broadly, as an array of contextually specified contingent practices and materials, instead of in terms of its propositional content, philosophical texts become amenable to an historical analysis that can produce empirically falsifiable claims, that is, where one describes rather than interprets or tries to explain. For instance, we can distinguish, how can we distinguish different schools according to this methodology? Many of the schools of ancient Greece shared similar philosophical propositions. Many partook of Plato's teachings, but the significance of their divergences would be insufficiently elucidated if we were to simply outline a number of doctrinal differences. For these discursive tensions reflect different visions of how to live the good life. For the Stoics, it is to become a rational person aligned with universal reason, while for the Epicureans, it is the tranquility of the soul. And there are accompanying exercises to realize these ideal selves, that is, to become the sage. In the case of the Stoics, they emphasize attention as a fundamental spiritual attitude, while for the Epicureans, the contemplation of the physical world is underlined as their central therapy. Importantly, along with Hadot, by applying this methodology, I'm not taking a position on the truth value of the philosophical propositions of Badiou's discourse. Rather, I'm suspending my judgment of the truth or falsity of the philosophical propositions we come across tonight in order to make these texts amenable to empirical, historically contextualized description. I'm thus engaging in a kind of Pyrrhonian skepticism, if that helps you position me, and thus whether one wishes to follow or reject a given philosophy is not a matter of reason or deduction, but a question of whether one has undergone a prior existential conversion by which they assume the fundamental convictions of the given school. And so begins practicing the spiritual exercises that lead towards the ideal self of that school. So then the question becomes, why does this apply to Badiou? We were talking about ancient philosophers the whole time. Badiou is not an ancient philosopher. So what is important is that Hadot's conception of philosophy is also a metaphilosophical claim, and not simply a historical one. But it is not making a claim from a philosophical position or specifically about philosophical propositions. Rather, Hadot is arguing that the very form of ancient philosophy meant that those philosophers conceived of philosophy as a way of life. Now, I'll put the historical debates concerning the degree to which we can extend this metaphilosophical conception beyond the Greek, Hellenistic, and Roman context to one side. But what is important to recognize here is that Badiou shares Hadot's metaphilosophical view of philosophy as a way of life. And he is fairly explicit about this in several texts. In his short book, Happiness, he states, all philosophy, even and above all when it is supported by complex scientific knowledges, innovative works of art, revolutionary politics, intense loves, is a metaphysics of happiness, or it's not worth narrow about trouble. Philosophy for Badiou is about living the good life, that is, life lived in accordance with the idea. We find this Platonistic telos not only in his small books, but explicitly laid out in Logics of Worlds and Immanence. A more recent text, In Praise of Philosophy, is perhaps the most explicit articulation of this conception. Here, Badiou writes that the aim of philosophy is truly to arouse in each and every one of us a new desire, which Plato calls the desire of the idea. He also writes that the measure of success of a philosophy course, but also of one's own reading of a book of philosophy, if that reading is itself philosophical, is, I believe, something like a subjective transformation. So here Badiou explicitly acknowledges the inducing of desire that philosophy instills in order to produce a subjective transformation via spiritual exercises. In this case, the spiritual exercise is reading. And Hadot's metaphilosophical conception thus maps quite well onto Badiou. So this has been done before with being an event. So in line with this understanding, Ian Hunter contextualizes the notion of spiritual exercise in terms of the Heideggerian figure of thought implicit in Badiou's mathematical ontology in being an event. Significantly, Hunter writes that Badiou's discourse is grounded in the, quote, discipline of Heideggerian metaphysics, whereby Badiou's claim to treat set theory formalistically encounters the contradictory claim that these names or formulas have the role of articulating objects that already exist but are indiscernible. This dilemma is then systematically transmuted into a paradox whose central form is the act of mathematical naming of the event, by which the subject summons unpresentable being into thought and existence, is simultaneously the moment in which the event summons the subject into existence as the being in which being is disclosed and concealed, unquote. So, what is Hunter saying? Hunter's characterizing the Badiouian gymnastic as a kind of therapy by which the subject, through exceptional efforts, breaks away from the doxic attitudes of the ordinary situation, placing Badiou's exercises in this ancient philosophical tradition that it inherits from the phenomenological tradition, likely Kant, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, and Sartre. as this was the dominant tradition during his adolescence and served as the background for his formation in philosophy at the ENS. So on Hunter's reading, Badiou's discourse is thus characterized as one that, quote, makes access to the objects of philosophical knowledge conditional on the performance of the Heideggerian conversion paradoxes that spiritually qualify the subject to accede to truth, unquote. Therefore, rather than treat Badiou's work in terms of its propositional content, Hunter redescribes his mathematical ontology as the simultaneous enactment and erection of a spiritual ascesis. To suspend judgment of the truth value of Badiouian discourse enables Hunter to enact his true aim, to, quote, help purge the desire to undertake it, unquote. So in this way, Hunter's analysis constitutes its own alternative spiritual exercise. This aim of Hunter's ascesis is misdirected, however. As Knox Peden points out, Hunter's historical redescription does not constitute a critique of Badiou, but rather would be a good description of the task of philosophy for a Badiouan, as we have already seen previously. Peden nonetheless overlooks a potential issue in Hunter's claim that Badiou's work may be regarded as embedded in a Heideggerian theology or sect. This challenges the Badiouan vocation insofar as it collapses the teachings of being an event within an apparently irreconcilable rival metaphysical doctrine. Hunter's aim to suspend the effective state of those Badiouians who come to desire truth is then served most fruitfully by the discursive proximity he claims to identify between Heidegger and Badiou. Yet, the inheritance of prefabricated elements from a previous discourse and their use are two entirely different things. As Hadot writes, each school represents a form of life defined by an ideal of wisdom. The result is that each one has its corresponding fundamental inner attitude. For Hadot and Hunter, philosophical speech constitutes an act which they describe as a spiritual exercise. Whether two philosophies are identical is therefore determined by how they employ a given vocabulary rather than simply by their background grammar. The question of whether Badiou is really part of a Heideggerian sect is thus dependent on Badiou's goals in the usage of his discourse. That is, it depends on the concrete aim of his spiritual exercises and not simply on the reenactment of Heideggerian gymnastics. Now, in my talk on Tuesday, which I don't think any of you are at, so that's fine, there's a bit of overlap, but I went into detail about why Badiou essentially isn't a Heideggerian. I basically argued that they aim to inculcate two different comportments or subjectivities. Badiou's is that of a militant engagement, a la Jean-Paul Sartre, and Heidegger's persona is one of reticent withdrawal and poetical contemplation. To demonstrate this point in a more detailed fashion and to better understand the specificity of Badiou's spirituality, for the remainder of this talk, I will explore how the immanence constitutes its own extended spiritual exercise. Okay, so do a brief summary. So the Immanence of Truth is the third volume of the Being an Event trilogy and must be understood in this context. The first volume, Being an Event, outlines a theory of universal truth and states that set theory is the discourse of being qua being. Set theory is ontology. Basically, for Badiou, being is a multiple of multiples without one, and this can be formalized as sets in mathematics. So I don't want to go too much into that, but this first volume is centered around the notion of genericity, or the generic, which emerges from an event that breaks with the laws of being. This is articulated principally through some basic set theory, constructibility, and Paul Cohen's notion of forcing. Then Logics of Worlds, the second volume, develops this idea by explaining how this ontologically described universal truth can appear in a world. Badiou describes this phenomenology using an algebraically flavored category theory. Category theory is just a kind of mathematics that formalizes objects according to the actions and relations they possess with surrounding objects in a network. So it's quite nice if we're going to think about things in terms of relationality. Now, in the third volume, he wishes to explain the structure of truth itself, not its universality, not its particularity, but its singularity, or more importantly, what he calls the absoluteness of truths. For this, he shall again use set theory, and specifically the theory of large cardinals. Now, the limitation of being an event for Badiou is that it merely gave us a negative universality via the generic set, since it cannot be identified by intrinsic properties of, the truth can't be identified by its intrinsic properties, but it's simply a set that cannot be defined within our everyday situation. Whereas in immanence, Badiou looks at how generic sets can be used to produce new infinities and thereby provides a rich account of the an account of the rich inner structure of truth procedures. What he aims to do is to ascend the hierarchy of set-theoretic infinities towards the absolute referent and thereby make productive the infinite truths that are immanent to our world. So there are 9 sections of immanence. The first 2 discuss the ontological structure of finitude through a critique of the covering over of the infinite. The 3rd to 6th sections deal with the ontology of higher infinite, specifically inaccessible cardinals, compact cardinals. those defined by extreme size and then proximity to the absolute. And the final three sections analyze the four modalities of works of truths. So now I'll provide a redescription of parts of that. So in the first section, he outlines four forms of finitude, which are identity, repetition, evil, and necessity or God. Finitude is represented as the dominant ideology of today's world, where radical novelties or change are denied. The notion of the constructible universe, something taken from set theory, is then metaphorized as the formal structure of finitude. I do not have time to go into the formalism here, but just to give you a brief example, which I think is useful to consider for the rest of the talk. We can define the constructible universe in set theory recursively by defining L naught here as equal to an empty set. We just stipulate this. And then we introduce for every successive ordinal alpha, an ordinal is just, if you think about like first, second, third, the notion of an ordinal just generalizes this notion to infinite sets. So it's this notion of order. For each successive ordinal alpha, we have this next level, L alpha plus 1, which is defined as being equal to def L alpha, and that is just the definable subsets of the lower level L alpha. We then get to lambda, which is a limit ordinal. A limit ordinal is just an ordinal such that for every ordinal alpha, it's going to be smaller than this limit ordinal lambda. And we can define L lambda as simply the union of every level L alpha, where alpha is less than lambda. And finally, we can then just define the constructible hierarchy in a fourth stage as the union of all these levels L alpha, where alpha is an element of the class of ordinals. The class of ordinals is just every ordinal, but it's not a set, which I'll come to. So what I want to point out here in this formal definition, and what's important, the reason why I put the math in, is we've nowhere met the ordinary language notions of finitude or its extra mathematical philosophical associations that Badiou will make. To emphasize the background philosophy of mathematics that Badiou will mobilize, I want to point out that we could take an alternative view, such as Ludwig Wittgenstein's, and simply view such a formal language as having no relation to experience at all, or not in this sense. Instead, we could treat formal languages as autonomous calculi or grammars, whose operations reflect nothing beyond their concrete calculations used in specific contexts. That is, in the forms of life the grammar corresponds to. Most probably in this case, the forms of life of a lonely academic mathematician. But Badiou does not take this route. Okay, he doesn't take this philosophy of mathematics. Instead, he engages in an allegoresis, that is, an allegorical reading of a non-allegorical text, and presents us with an existential choice. Will I say what is constructible, or will I admit the possibility of beings that exist but are not constructible? He writes, quote, "Am I going to occupy my place in the order of constructibility, that is, the definable? Am I going to try to be placed? Or ultimately, am I going to accept the need for wandering, for a universality that partly dissolves my singularity? Because that is what the generic is, something that is unstable as to its name, its disposition, and even its phantom-like existence. Thus, all thought contains a fundamental choice, whether overt or covert, the constructible or the generic." Unquote. So we are thus presented with an existential choice. Our decision cannot be decided through logical deduction or empirical evidence. Rather, it derives from a fundamental inner attitude. Badiou exhorts the reader to participate in his discourse on infinity. Here we can see how he continues to oppose Heidegger's finitude via Heideggerian language. For instance, he classes, quote, "fetishized national histories, the claim of incomparable uniqueness, the absolute value of our Christian roots, and family values, corporations, regional chauvinism, under the, quote, general logic of finitude. They are part of the covering over of possibilities against which a fundamental ethics must stand. As he writes, you must contribute to uncovering. The vehicle for this uncovering operates through his notion of the ultrafilter, which then becomes the most important concept of the whole theory of infinite multiplicities. So as in Being an Event, where Badiou transfigures the empty set into a symbol of the Heideggerian notion of the being of beings, from which all beings emanate, here he transforms the set-theoretic ultrafilter into an emblem of subjective choice, centered on the finitude dyad. Badiou metaphorizes the ultrafilter as a net for finding large infinities, transmuting it into a tool for actively engaging in new possibilities. He writes, quote, "It is actually a change in the filter by which human activity is measured. It is no longer money or some abstract general equivalent. Rather, it is the centrality, monitored on every level of collective existence, of a shared notion of the common good. In other words, the centrality of a communist politics of production, exchange, and their historical development." Unquote. So this transfigured notion is now divided between two personages, the individual subjected to capital and the communist. The ultrafilter functions here as an intellectual vehicle for the mastery of an ascetic regimen. While the principal ultrafilter, specifically a principal one, is defined by a specific subset of the initial set, that is, it's rooted in a basic element and so, quote, cannot inspire confidence, a non-principal ultrafilter is not constructed on a stationary element and so is a, quote, maximality freed from the one. So ontologically redescribing this distinction between principal and non-principal ultrafilters enables Badiou to continue his political parallel between finitude and infinity. For Badiou, all oppression by finitude involves an implicit figure of the one, and the principal ultrafilter correspondingly is enrooting everything in the overabundant X of the powers of privatization, he writes. By contrast, a communist politics means the, quote, abolition of private property and the tearing up of roots. Here, Badiou clearly alludes to Heidegger's ultranationalist politics, but repurposes and inverts his language. Modernity is, quote, rootless for Heidegger, a form of calculative thinking detached from the ground or soil, in German Boden, a word which carries the Nazi connotations of Blut und Boden, or blood and soil. Heidegger thus calls on his participants to assert a new autochthony that challenges the errancy of calculative thinking. And yeah, I didn't mention it here, but yeah, that also has heavy anti-Semitic overtones, but I won't beat up Heidegger the whole time. So by contrast, for Badiou, bourgeois modernity is the ultra-filter called capital, which enroots everything and hence constitutes the roots of oppression. The Heideggerian figure of the Heimat, or homeland, is not opposed, but identified as the obverse of a destructive capitalistic modernity, thereby undermining Heidegger's pastoral comportment from within. So based on these observations, it needs to be concluded that Badiou continues to enact a Heideggerian allegoresis in the case of the ultrafilter and constructibility, but clearly in an effort to promote a radically opposing notion of political subjectivity. The non-principal ultrafilter is reconfigured as an emblem of radical activity, imminently transcending the finite world. Badiou thus enjoins his participants to suspend thoughts of finitude and death, master the discourse of large infinities, choose the non-principal over the principal ultrafilter, and thereby ground Heideggerian grammar in a new form of life. So Badiou continues this tropological procedure with his discussion of the different types of infinity. He first outlines four approaches to infinity, which are related to previous philosophical and theological conceptions. So first, there is transcendence, which is only accessed negatively, since the infinite is simply that which is incommensurable with the finite in this conception. And he likens this to negative theology or Neoplatonic Christianity. The second kind of infinity is the resistance to all divisions, which he likens to Spinoza's infinite substance, which preserves its unity even under a division into infinite modes. Third, there is a power of internal determinations, where infinity is first affirmatively defined. This is the first place we find a positive definition of infinity, since it has intrinsic characteristics which makes it infinite rather than being defined in terms of its relationship to the finite. So his example is Descartes' conception of God and existence in the ontological argument. Finally, there is the fourth kind of infinity, which is defined by its inner relationship with absoluteness as such. He says this approach is by successive approximations. He writes, infinity is thought of as the approaching of a figure of the absolute, ultimately identified with nothingness or with the unthinkable itself. In that case, it remains inaccessible in a sense, but what is accessible is a rational movement towards it. Interestingly, this is the one kind of infinity that Badiou does not provide a philosophical counterpart to, though he does provide a theological comparison, relating it to the angiology of scholastic theologians and mysticism. He writes that this approach admits a hierarchical thinking, since there are degrees of proximity to the one infinity as inaccessible absolute. However, it animates this structure through a kind of mystical ecstasy, because the polarity of the ascending scale of degrees is also an approximation of an annihilation in ecstasy, unquote. So on the one hand, the approaching of the absolute through concepts is reflected in the hierarchy of angels and an ever closer proximity to the divine one infinity. On the other hand, mysticism through poetry, he writes, expresses the experience forms of ecstatic self-annihilation to which the hierarchy of angels points. For Badiou, the absolute referent is in one sense non-existent, but in another sense a norm of existence, which can for that reason be approached by increasingly intense or increasingly synthetic experience or forms of thought. Now, I'll not go into the details, but the set-theoretic concepts of inaccessible cardinals, partitions of infinity, compact and Ramsey cardinals, and finally the theorems about the class of ordinals V are successively metaphorized into four theophilosophical figures of infinity. Essentially, what are set-theoretic objects are transmuted into a dialectical symbology by which various ontotheological figures of thought are successively identified with each higher infinite. And this continues the process Hunter observes in being an event. From a rhetorical perspective, I might add, the hierarchy of infinities provides a powerful analytical panacea by which Badiou dialectically subsumes rival philosophical doctrines within his overarching ontological system, first set out in being an event. So, now what's really important here is the notion of truth, the inner structure of truth. And what is that? That's expressed through the works of truth. So to realize this enriched notion, Badiou discussions the notion of a work which establishes the absoluteness of a truth, or the relation of a truth to an attribute of the absolute. Truth, we shall recall, is the generic or indiscernible, which is a set of elements whose elements cannot be defined by a shared property. And I mean, yeah, that sounds arcane. The proletariat might be the most easy metaphor, right? Like the proletariat's like, oh, you've got nothing to lose but your chains. It's what is not accepted, positively identified by the system. That's the immediate political metaphor. So a work of truth is a finite but dynamic fragment of such a procedure of discerning the indiscernible. He writes, this also means that the work of truth, since it is finite, can no doubt be statically defined by enumerating the elements that compose it. But in so doing, we miss the essential, which is that it only exists in the movement whereby the procedural construction of the infinite truth that is dependent on the vanished event unfolds infinitely, unquote. So here we can see that Badiou is emphasizing that the importance of the work of truth is fundamentally in how it cannot be simply defined. That is, its philosophical significance does not lie in it as a merely theoretical entity. Rather, there is what he calls the index of the work, which cannot be identified with one of its parts. So about this, he writes, the index, okay, if it can't be identified, what is it? I mean, so he's going to say, the index is, for example, what literary criticism seeks to identify as the criterion of the exceptional greatness of a novel, and which is found in the commented text, even though it is none of the textual components of that text. It is also what is expressed in the phrase, I love you, which, if it is not a lie, encompasses the dynamic totality of love without being able to be reduced to one or another of its episodes. In a physics theory, which we can be integrally transmitted in the real, in a physics theory, which can be integrally transmitted in the form of mathematized statements, the index is experimental in the sense that the external real point enveloped in the theoretical formalism is validated or corrected by observation, even though, strictly speaking, that real, inasmuch as it is thought, is integrally expressed by the formalism. The index of a politics is often the consciousness of a victorious orientation, of inclusion in a historic way forward, which is not reducible to any of the tactical, hence empirically finite victories, no matter how great they may be, such as, for example, the seizure of power, unquote. So those are the examples he gives. So when he first introduces it. So in this sense, the index of the work of truth can be seen as the formalization within philosophical discourse of the very philosophical process of subjectivization, or subjectivation, which constitutes the Badiouian gymnastic, whereby one performs spiritual exercises to ascend towards the absolute, to ascend towards and touch the absolute, thereby it's partaking in a divine ecstasy. Indeed, for Badiou, whether something is a work or a waste product essentially lies in the index, the irreducible concrete enactment or instantiation of a given ensemble, whether it is thought in art, science, politics, or love. Now, seeing that the notion of the absolute and the degrees of proximity to it occupies the goal of Badiou's exercise, it quickly appears a lot like Neoplatonic spirituality. For instance, he metaphorizes the notion of a complete cardinal in the following way. The existence of a non-trivial explicit relation from the absolute to one of its attributes has as its existential witness a very large, at least complete, infinity. Unquote. So what is a purely set theoretic notion is therefore transfigured into an ontological statement, which then allows him to put what he calls limitations on the power of finitude. This is laid out in Scott's theorem. Essentially, Scott's theorem states that if we can prove the existence of a certain type of very large infinity, called a complete cardinal, then we can say that the constructible hierarchy L is not identical to the class of sets V. So basically what the absolute is not identical to how we can define it. So Badiou understands this to say that we can reject then the thesis of finitude that every multiplicity is constructible. That is, the axiom of constructibility is false if we admit a certain type of large infinity. Again, this is transmuted into a conviction. I hold that there is a kind of infinity that is so large it actually undermines the dominant ideology of the world. Here, Badiou emphasizes a kind of mystical experience that allows us to cultivate ourselves, to attain a comportment, or transform our vision in such a way that we can reject any instantiation of the general view of conservative ideology. Most importantly, to realize this kind of comportment, Badiou essentially transmutes the set-theoretic notion of V, the class of all sets or all ordinals, into the absolute, thereby leading to an aporia. What's that aporia? Either it is, which is absurd, since it's not a set, so it can't be, or it is not, which is absurd, because the work is. This aporia emerges because of the transmutation of V into a symbol for the absolute, and it becomes a condition for the, quote, thinkability of the index of the work. It becomes a condition for the thinkability of the very process of transforming oneself, you could say. So in other words, it becomes a condition to accede to the truth. In moving through the complex details of set theory and continually metaphorizing it, Badiou erects a series of conversion paradoxes by which he inculcates a militant comportment. Now I'll turn to the final part here, where I will discuss Meillassoux' commentary on the Neoplatonic structure, so we can identify the genealogy of this exercise. Okay. Okay, so according to Badiou's ontology, V cannot be, since it is not a set. So it can't be because it's not a set. It's not a set because of Russell's paradox. Russell's paradox just says, like, if you have a set of sets, then that itself has to be one of its parts, right? If it's a set, then the set of sets would contains itself. You have this mise en abîme, and it kind of all breaks down, at least within ZFC. So, but yet it must be in the sense that it is the place in which every multiple or set resides. Meillassoux then asked the question, what is V's ontological status? For Meillassoux, Badiou attempts to say something besides that V is or is not, but does not ultimately overcome the aporia. To explain this apparent shortcoming, Meillassoux turns to Badiou's discussion of the dialectic of the one and the multiple in being an event and relates this to Neoplatonism, specifically the historical Neoplatonism from Plotinus to Proclus. Briefly, Meillassoux suggests that Badiou echoes the Neoplatonic aporias, but in the context of contemporary mathematics, which is made of the void and infinity and no longer the monad of the Greeks. But he goes on to defend Badiou's Neoplatonism against possible materialist criticisms or criticisms that Badiou's philosophy fails to be materialist. He suggests that if we align Badiou with Neoplatonism, then this will lead his philosophy to a thinking of transcendence. But to avoid the anti-materialist implications of this, Meillassoux distinguishes two types of transcendence, religious and philosophical. The religious here leads to a return of the subject to God, whereas philosophical transcendence depends only on the discipline of the subject and not on the action upon him of the principle which he attempts to attain. Meillassoux writes that this refers to the rigorous work of the concept, up to the non-conceptual encounter with the condition of the concept, in the form of an experience of fusion with the one, but which is above all non-empirical. So now that's his description of Neoplatonism. But if we ignore that part about the fusion with the one, which is the key aspect of Neoplatonism, Meillassoux sees a similarity here in the non-empirical experience represented by the work of truth that touches the absolute. For Meillassoux, since this work of truth is neither empirical nor an event, it cannot be said to derive from truth procedures, that is, politics, science, love, or poetry, and it also can't come from the constructible world, right? Rather, the experience of the index is a resource internal to philosophy. It, quote, resides precisely in the necessary ontological aporia of the absolute, itself indispensable to the being of the index. Okay, so now we come to the whole point. So Meillassoux' explanation is clarifying, yet its analysis takes place from within Badiou's philosophy. That is, it is animated by the existential conviction of the Badiouan. By contrast, I seek an empirical description of Badiou's philosophy without promoting an ideological or metaphysical conviction of the truth. So, if we return to the position of description, we can redescribe this non-empirical experience as a form of existential conversion. As Meillassoux writes, this experience reveals that the absolute can impose itself on you before all knowledge and before all discourse. Unquote. So this is precisely how Hadot understands spiritual exercises. Here, the preceding conditions to engage in a philosophical discourse and undertake its difficult gymnastics are the exercises of the reading and contemplation of Badiou's work. So Meillassoux writes that this grasping of transcendence is philosophical, not religious, and we can align this distinction between Plotinus and Augustine spiritualities. As Kolakowski writes, Plotinus's absolute is human nature, man discovers it within him as his true self and recognizes that eternity is his native home, whereas Augustinian man identifies himself as a helpless, miserable being incapable of self-liberation, unquote. So Badiou is thus much closer to a Neoplatonic than a Christian spirituality. Nonetheless, this Neoplatonic Christianity, Neoplatonic Christianity was integrated into early Christianity, or Neoplatonism more generally, and it was a way of living in conformity with the divine logos, and originally presented itself as a philosophy. Christianity did. So most importantly, whether Badiou truly belongs to a Neoplatonic school or a Christian one is dependent on whether he realizes practices whose telos conforms to the ways of living promoted by the Neoplatonic school, or by any of those schools. Otherwise, he is just repurposing a set of homologous exercise and grammars inherited from his Christian background for a different end, and therefore constituting a distinct school of philosophy. If we consider the case of the school of Plotinus, its students lived in accordance with the intellect, whereby the self is transformed into a transcendent self. But in this process, political action falls away. And this is clearly not the kind of philosophical persona Badiou has in mind. On the other hand, the emphasis on an ascetic lifestyle, whereby the self is detached from sensation, imagination, and the passions through the ascension towards the one or absolute, does reflect some continuity between Badiou and Neoplatonic spirituality. As Kolakowski also writes, Plotinus's work is not a metaphysical system, since language cannot express the most important truths. It is not a theory, but a work of spiritual counsel, a guide for the use of those who wish to set about liberating themselves from temporal being. Unquote. So early German philosophers such as Jakob Böhme inherit this dialectical approach via early Christianity and influence the school of German idealism, most famously Hegel, who then imparts this approach to his most famous successor, Karl Marx. So given this formative context, we can see that Badiou recontextualizes the essence of this spirituality he originally imbibed through his Marxist catechism, but inflects it with the Heideggerian grammar of the French educational institutions in which he was formed. Outside of these institutional and political contexts, though, what is important to see is that Badiou's philosophical text erects a final conversion discourse for the reader. By accepting the analogies he draws between mathematical finitude and political repression, he leads those who wish to overcome this through a series of intellectual exercises or spiritual exercises designed to transform oneself through the staging of conversion paradoxes, whereby one becomes part of a spiritual elect who have unique insight into possible political transformations, which by definition transcend the everyday consciousness. Carl J. Calwadis provides the following description of these kinds of paradoxes and crises that for him constitute philosophy and philosophy more generally. He writes, "A crisis is such a severe disruption that the ordinary ways of relieving the discomfort become increasingly inadequate. This does not mean that we can restore the familiarity. Indeed, when a crisis occurs, most often our first response is to do all we can to cling to the familiar. But if we do, it is extremely difficult because the resources for preserving familiarity are stretched to the limit. If, however, we do not rigidly insist on maintaining the familiar, we are in a position to see in a radically different way. The momentum of maintaining familiarity is enormously powerful, and we are strongly inclined to believe that what we usually do is adequate. But at the same time, we experience an abiding doubt that we cannot ignore. The tension of this dilemma suspends us and enables us to see what we previously could not because we were identical with it." Unquote. So in Badiou's specific case, the familiar becomes the finite or the constructible, and the unfamiliar is the generic. This in turn allows us to see the finite for what it is, which is a waste product of the infinite. The aporiae of the absolute thus allows one to suspend themselves across both sides of this divide, and thereby continually induce doubt in the finite and certainty in the existence of the infinite at every successive overcoming or apparent resolution of the central motivating paradox as they ascend the hierarchy of infinities. We can thus see that, in Immanence, Badiou sustains and elevates the earlier antinomies of being an event, since he provides a systematic description of the internal structure of the spiritual exercises demanded of the practitioner in both being an event and logics of worlds. Whereas being an event simply describes the formal structure of this project in general, and logics of worlds locates it in particular contexts. But I would importantly suggest that there is a significant transformation of the gymnastic in Immanence. The original crisis that is induced at the opening of being an event through the dialectic of the one and the multiple is integrated here into a global exercise of self-transformation and thus stabilization of the self. One is not simply asked to submit to a truth that transcends the world, but has the guarantee of its eternal absoluteness. Badiou formalizes some of the existential attitudes one may assume in such a context, such as constructibility or conservatism, and genericity or revolutionary thinking. He then calls upon the participant to take the path that will lead towards ascension, The hierarchy of ordinals and cardinals you see here is thus a kind of picture of this process, similarly to how Plato's allegory of the cave is a picture of the dialectical ascension towards the good. Only now, Badiou's paideia or existential pedagogy instrumentalizes fragments of set theory and mobilizes a quasi-Marxian historiosophy in order to realize its demanding regimen. In so doing, Badiou aims to inculcate a new kind of discipline, a philosophical persona that one forms through the incorporation and work on truths. In doing this, Badiou repeats an exercise through conversion paradoxes that we can observe from ancient Greece to the present day. But he collects together a contingent set of practices and materials for the formation of a special kind of self, and thereby establishes a new school of thought, but now modernized, including aspects of set theory and political reflections on the 20th century. In this way, Badiou's Immanence exploits a broadly Neoplatonic grammar, as Meillassoux demonstrates, but incorporates it with Marxian and Heideggerian vocabularies to form a distinctly contemporary persona. In this way, Immanence maintains continuity with the militant subjectivity we first see emerge in being an event, only now the evolution of that militant self is put in proper view. In the final analysis, to be properly inculcated into the Badiouian regimen is to convert to the politically radical convictions that demand a rejection of finitude and then, through the endurance of a series of paradoxes, to enact a renovated form of Neoplatonic spirituality, whose telos lies in the ideal self of the militant philosopher. Thank you.
We have just under 20 minutes of questions.